within merely only 2 hours' time. And it only took that long just because the pararescue forces and the base security personnel present on the Kirtland Air Force Base had put up as stiff of a resistance as they humanly could, as was feasible to do in their current situation, as the heavily armed Iranian armored battalions, two of which had sliced their way deep into the installation, and rapidly so, as all their movements were ISR directed by their platoon-level quadcopter reconnaissance assets, as well as the high-altitude coalition recon drones in the form of their Mohajer 6 of the Iranian forces, as well as the Chinese PLA-WZ-8 drone of the Chinese forces, and the Russian military's 4-post high-altitude recon drones, all operating over the Albuquerque area, overlaying with satellites of the coalition, as well as also the quadcopter assets used at the platoon level by the Iranian forces, as well as the company level by the Pakistani forces, as the Iranians were heavily supported by their own self-propelled 155mm artillery, their own loitering munitions in the form of their Shahed 238s, as well as also the immensity of the air power provided predominantly PLAAF form of their JH-7 ground attack aircraft, conducting a myriad of different airstrikes, some in the close air support role, while others were more on the strategic level, hitting pre-designated targets as per the original battle plan, with the J-10 fighters flying over the entire battle space, providing air superiority to the ground forces involved, as also even the Pakistani Mirage 5 squadron had sent a pair of these ground attack aircraft to conduct strikes of their own as per the original battle plan as it pertained to the installation on Kirtland. By the end of the Iranian forces having simply overrun the entire facility, with even their movements ISR directed to pincer and surround large groupings of combatants before simply saturating them with heavy firepower and destroying them, as they now were conducting a logistical pause after having captured the entire installation, as well as also consolidating their current positions and establishing a security perimeter between the installation that they had captured and the international airport, or Sunport as it's called, as the remains of the American security personnel for the base, as well as also the pararescue forces that were present that managed to retreat, had retreated into the adjacent international Sunport to put up further resistance against the coalition, as the two Iranian armored battalions settled in to their new positions. They now held the perimeter and faced off against the remains of the American forces. As it pertained to the actions being described, these forces, in conjunction with their armored infantry battalion outside of the installation, having begun on CCP regime properties in the south of the city, and were rapidly joined by an armored battalion speeding up the roads adjacent to I-25 deep into the city's downtown, would essentially block off the Sunport from the west. And as the American forces were now trapped in the international Sunport, those that had retreated from the air base and some that were already there, establishing a presence as per their orders, similar to other types of American military forces throughout the entire South Central invasion sector and beyond. The international Sunport was considered critical infrastructure and thus had to be defended and guarded as the international tensions had arisen. But now, the Iranian artillery forces, with the assistance of their Mohajer-6 high-altitude armed recon drone, as well as also quadcopter assets of the forces adjacent to the international Sunport, would direct precision artillery strikes onto any forces that dared reveal themselves outside of the buildings, as the buildings were off limits, as per edicts from the CCP regime of China. This was forbidden, as these facilities needed to be captured as much intact as was humanly possible, and only artillery could be utilized in areas that were not considered critical infrastructure, such as the buildings themselves, and also great care should be taken, as per the edict, to avoid destroying the runways as much as possible, with mitigating damage to them, although it was considered acceptable in some cases to utilize artillery and other weaponry on the taxiways and runways. It was highly discouraged by the CCP regime and was passed down to the allies in the alliance. As it pertained to the Pakistani forces, their 18th Infantry Division was already well on the move, as its comprising battalions, which included their combat engineering forces pressing into the city, as the Babur Alpha 1s, which were terrain-hugging cruise missiles that carried a hefty payload and were highly precise, had begun to strike the city's bridge infrastructure, leaving very little way out for the American National Guard forces, as this was part of the grand strategy to trap all American military forces strictly in the east of the entire city, as they could be more easily managed there, which included the National Guard forces, which had hurriedly fled their bivouac sites the moment the first shells began to come in, as they had lost communications, which signaled to their proactive leadership that they needed to get the hell out of their current positions and get their men in gear, which they managed to do, and they managed to leave as 155 shells, Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles, as well as Chinese DF-2s and even DF-21As from the active duty battalions that comprise the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades, had begun to come in and strike these areas, as well as the Chinese and Iranian and Pakistani missiles striking the installation itself. As the artillery and missile strikes were coming in, tactical airstrikes would be coming in as well in due time, but for the time being, as it was now 1 a.m. during the time of the actions occurring on the Kirtland Air Base, the forces of one of multiple mechanized infantry battalions of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division was moving in to secure I-40, as this was a main entry and exit point to the west of the city, and thus needed to be controlled. And as the high-altitude reconnaissance assets of the coalition, the Mohajer-6, the WZ-8 high-altitude stealth recon drone, and the Russian four-post high-altitude recon drone had spotted militia activity throughout the outer portions of the city, as again, as mentioned before, there were many hardy people that lived in the deserts and also in the mountains of New Mexico. And these people, again, had a lot of skills and a lot of experience with camping as well as other survival-like skills. And these people would make a stand against the invasion forces as the lights had gone out due to the tandem cyber and anti-satellite strikes that opened up the entire invasion. As with all other battles, people were moving to and fro, and there had been sightings of these Pakistani forces of this mechanized infantry battalion moving up the country roads, the rural desert roads, and people had spotted them and had hurriedly alerted people they knew as far as these militia types of personnel that lived in the area, many of them off of I-40 in this particular area and even beyond in the hinterlands. As the call to arms had effectively gone out, as the non-combatants and combatants alike were seeing the movements of these forces, many had grabbed their personal weapons. However, unbeknownst to them, the coalition would get the complete drop on them first, as the ISR dominance of the entire coalition, including the AI real-time battlefield data processing systems of the Chinese and even the Russians that basically glued the entire coalition together and processed all data instantaneously, including translations between the different foreign forces. This made the reaction times to changes on the battlefield exceedingly fast, far faster than would have ever before been possible, especially in a coalition of multiple different nations working together. As the JH-7s had largely been active in the Kirtland battle that was unfolding at about this time, still, as it was 1 a.m. when this battle began, the Pakistani forces had originated on their rural CCP regime properties and had moved up the rural routes to secure I-40 as at its western end of the city of Albuquerque, as the combat engineer forces and a brigade headquarters battalion of one of the two comprising brigades of the 18th ID were moving through the area. The combat engineers were conducting a flank clearance operation before they were to move deep into the city and establish their blocking position along the only bridges left intact, which were the highway bridge of I-40 itself, as well as the adjacent street bridges that basically crossed on either side. As these forces were conducting flank clearance operations throughout the entire region, this also included actions that were occurring in the north of the city as reactionary armed civilians to the immediate northwest of the Double Eagle Airport, which actually ended up standing in the way of it for this mechanized infantry battalion, had clashed with them within the first 30 minutes of them leaving their CCP regime property. An armored battalion was moving into the city from north of it, as well as also a mechanized infantry battalion, all under their own artillery fire support, as this armored battalion would end up encircling and destroying armed reactionary civilians. As with this mechanized infantry battalion near the Cottonwood Mall, they would engage another group of armed reactionary civilians in this northern part of Albuquerque, as the combat engineers of one of the two brigades, as there were two combat engineer battalions, would essentially establish control over the banks of the river and lay out a PB-79A pontoon bridge, as the river in this particular area was rather deep for fording for many of the vehicles, and hence a pontoon bridge would be necessary, as the Babur Alpha 1s had destroyed all the other bridges. And it was determined that a pontoon bridge should be laid for other forces to move in to reinforce the forces on the east side of the city. the other armored battalion of 2 was moving deep into the city to rendezvous with Iranian forces and help to trap the forces of the Americans, who now had no idea exactly where enemies were or what exactly the hell was going on, and they were going to begin to send out reconnaissance parties to go recon areas around their main positions and report back to them so they could figure out a way to escape the situation, as other armed reactionary civilians would be engaged as a mechanized infantry battalion would cross into the north of the city. All hell would break loose within the city, and combat in downtown would be heavy, not only between elements of the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade as 2 additional battalions that originated on CCP properties to the southwest of the city would cross the last remaining bridges into the downtown area, but also because the artillery shelling was now becoming ever more intense, as one of the 2 artillery battalions was shelling the entire downtown area, as they were supporting all of their forces moving in. As the Pakistani forces had support from their JF-17Bs, their Chinese-made top-of-the-line 4.5 generation fighter aircraft, which both Pakistan and China, of course, possessed, would be flying air superiority operations, but they carried a limited number for the time of air-to-ground munitions and would be utilizing some of them in support of their ground forces in the close air support role. As it pertained to the artillery, they too would be conducting fire missions as per ISR data or even radio calls, as the Pakistani army was in the midst of a modernization program, and while they had company-level ISR assets that could essentially ascertain the coordinates for artillery fire missions, they could also call them in by radio still, do them the old way. As it pertained to their armored forces, their Viper IFVs and their powerful 30mm autocannons, 7.62mm coax, and 2 Concours missile systems, they had ERA plating on the front and a pleak armor on the sides. These were relatively capable infantry fighting vehicles, and the Talha armor personnel carriers, along with the Al-Khalid main battle tanks, formed the tank companies and armored infantry companies of the armored battalions, as these were track-based battalions, whereas the mechanized infantry battalions were wheel-based and used the Al-Fad, a Saudi-built armored fighting vehicle which came in an IFV version, an APC version, and even an assault gun version. But the Pakistanis, who had purchased these and procured them in large numbers from Saudi Arabia, well in excess of 1,500, had both the APC and IFV version for their mechanized infantry forces, who would also, besides rolling into battle in these vehicles, be utilized by combat engineer forces as well, as the IFV version had a 40mm autocannon, which was extremely powerful as the 30mm autocannons and even 35mm autocannons, such as that used on certain Chinese IFVs. As powerful as those were, the 40mm autocannon was a true monster. And in lieu of a coax machine gun, there was a turret-mounted Chinese W-85 heavy machine gun, which was a 12.7mm heavy machine gun. This is a Chinese-made HJ-08 anti-tank missile being fired, an Iranian Shahed 238 loitering munition, and air-dropped munitions coming from a Mirage 5. As this blast in the distance on this hill is from other 1,000-pound munitions that were dropped on the area. The combat engineers, again, as they would establish control over the banks of the river, would clash with armed reactionary civilians and even by the I-40 crossing with military forces, as this Pakistani combat engineer is operating the one-time use weapon, the Spanish-made Al-Qatan, which was a very powerful, disposable one-time use anti-armor weapon, which was fully capable of destroying a main battle tank, as it could penetrate over 600 millimeters of RHA, which is more than enough to destroy most main battle tanks, if not all of them, that were in the field. This combat engineer, firing out of this ammo can, this belted ammunition, is firing his MG3, as the Pakistani army had procured a relatively decent number of these general purpose machine guns, which had an extremely high rate of fire, similar to the German MG42 in World War II. The MG3 was essentially a simple upgraded version of that. And they also produced these by license in Pakistan. These other riflemen of the combat engineers are firing their Chinese-made Type 56 assault rifles, one of their standard issue assault rifles, besides the new PK-21 that was now being introduced throughout the Pakistani forces. As the mechanized infantry forces and combat engineers would clash with American National Guardsmen in the city, the fighting would be very intense, as well as also battling militiamen out in the desert, as these forces are conducting operations against them with their Al-Fad APCs and the IFVs, as well as heavy support from the air and loitering munitions, not to mention the mortar support as well from their LLR 81mm French-made mortars, as they procured these for some of their mortar forces in the past and still had these in service. As the battle that had broken out with militia-type forces by I-40 was underway, as the mechanized infantry battalion moved in to secure this key highway, as again, control of the key invasion routes, such as I-25 especially, the route taken by the external components of the 14th PLA Group Army and 18th PAP Brigade in this sector of the invasion, as that was an invasion prong, those two forces mentioned. Control of I-40 was also of high importance, and entry and exit points to the city would need to be locked down, including I-40 itself, as this mechanized infantry battalion was moving in to conduct this operation. They would have ample support from Mirage 5 ground attack aircraft of their Mirage 5 squadron, as well as also a pair of their JF-17B aircraft, who would be called in to provide limited close air support, as they again were mostly armed with air-to-air munitions, but did carry some air-to-ground munitions for that role of close air support. As we go to the map of the battle, the fighting in this area would essentially consist of the entire battalion having had moved into this portion of I-40 within this 2-mile by 1-mile area. As this map begins with these blasts coming from 4 1,000-pound munitions hitting this area by the railroad junction, as this is freight rail tracks that run through this area, as there was a freight line that ran along much of I-40, which is right here. The American militia-type forces were moving into an area that consisted of some stores, country stores essentially, along this road here that passes under this highway segment. And we're also using the tracks as fighting positions, as again, they'd been informed of the approach of these Pakistani forces. These are some trailers in the desert here, trailers off of this road, this country road, a house, gas station, a ranch with a fence around it, ranch house, silo, barn, country home, ranch on this hill here. There's a lot of hilly terrain in this area, including the hill that this ranch sat on. It was gently rolling on this side, but steep on this side. And, of course, the highway is slightly elevated on elevated grounds. It's hilly terrain in this area. And on this side, a slight hill and a taller hill that peaks right here. This home had already been destroyed as enemy combatants had been spotted moving into it, and thus the home was thoroughly fired upon by earlier passing Al-Fad vehicles, firing their very potent 40mm autocannon up the hill at this home, slamming into it with the HE armor-piercing ammunition, which shredded that house to pieces. So there were two other homes here along this road. These Mirage 5s, there were 3 of them in this battle, as well as also a pair of the JF-17 fighters that were patrolling the area, doing their combat air patrols in this particular area, and one would provide close air support by dropping 2 precision munitions on militia forces below it, which are right here. And these Mirage 5s, besides this one dropping an additional 4,000 pounds of munitions on this massive area here on top of this hill that this ranch sits on, the others would be firing the Ra'ad cruise missiles, which were air-to-ground cruise missiles that had a range of 340 miles and were fired to hit targets further afield from this battle. They were not being used in this battle, in other words. They were being fired at targets further away, such as targets in the city, as there was already ample combat going on everywhere, including down in here. Iranian forces had already crossed and now were entering downtown by this point in time as this battle was going on. The Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade Headquarters Battalion had authorized the use in support of the Pakistani forces of the Shahed 238s, the loitering munitions, and they were fired in support of the Pakistani forces and more to hit forces in this area, and even slightly off the map, as there were a few more technicals and armed personnel just off the map. There was a long line of pickup trucks and SUVs, basically technicals because they had armed men in them, essentially, that were flying down the road, and all of these vehicles would end up being annihilated as they would be ripped to pieces by these Al-Fad vehicles and troops wielding Al-Qatans and also HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, such as one being fired from another soldier just off this illustration, while the Al-Fad IFVs would be firing their horrifyingly devastating 40mm autocannons at anything that moved, as this wedge formation of troops and this rolling T formation of troops, as they were watching the tops of the hills and ahead, were moving into the area, and they would end up getting into a line formation. This platoon of infantry forces would move into the area and dismount the 4 additional squads of the platoon, as these 5 vehicles, one of which had already dismounted a squad to check this house, while this platoon had dismounted a single squad that advanced on the gas station. As they were doing so, early on, they were beginning to take fire from these vehicles as they were coming down the road, hence the green right here. And they would also dismount some of the armed men who would fire on these forces here, which the lead vehicle even was firing at these forces on the other side of the street, besides those moving up, like this whole platoon worth of vehicles from this company, of which their headquarters platoon is sitting here in this area with their fueler, armored recovery, MRAPs, and supply trucks and command vehicle, as well as there being a mortar platoon of LLR mortars, 81 millimeter, which are the French-made mortars, within their M113 mortar tracks that comprised the fire support company, which was a mortar company, of which one platoon was here and the rest were off the map and firing. The mortars would contribute heavily, just as would the air power and the Shahed 238s, to the coalition victory in this battle that would ultimately be relatively short-lived. As mortars splashed in this area, they had cut down these personnel on the other side of the road preparing to cross, as they had dismounted from their technical, or pickup truck, further off the map, which was now destroyed by these mortars as well as these personnel. Mortar landed right on the technical and blasted it and these personnel at the opening of the map. These personnel had been cut down by a mortar at the opening of a map, as were these personnel trying to take position on the hill. And this technical and these personnel were cut down by a mortar, as were these personnel and their technical. As these personnel were fleeing the area due to seeing the incoming jet screeching as it dropped its thousands of pounds of munitions, they barely avoided destruction as they were running extremely quick out of this area. The outer blast radius would only get this technical and these 2 personnel, but the rest of the munitions decimated this barn, the shed, and all of these technicals in the area. As that was occurring, this, at the opening of the map, had already gotten these personnel and their technicals and more personnel that were beside and inside of the country stores in this particular edge of the street. As this technical was destroyed, all of these personnel cut down by the 4,000 pounds of munitions that were dropped on them by the Mirage 5, which could carry over 8,000 pounds of payload, which was sufficient for the task at hand. As these Ra'ad cruise missiles were fired further afield, fired at targets in the city, they were not a factor in this particular battle. As these loitering munitions were moving off-map, one would turn and hit these personnel with an HE warhead, as well as this fighter aircraft, this JF-17B, dropping 2 1,000-pounders on this group right here at the opening of the battle. As the destruction was relatively rapid, the company operating to the north of this highway segment in this area was leaving their headquarters platoon a bit further back from the action as they moved slightly ahead, blocking the passage beneath this highway segment from this road right here. As that was going on, much of the fighting was already occurring as these technicals flew into action, although the lead technical was utterly annihilated by the fire it took from the vehicles as they pulled up to the gas station curb and fired at the lead vehicle and destroyed it with 40 millimeter fire, shredding it to pieces, with the others simply swerving around and getting to this point here, with personnel firing out of the passenger sides of the vehicles as well as also firing from the beds of the truck. And by the time they stopped, each truck and SUV deployed roughly between 4 to 5 men each, who all got out and were laying down small arms fire at this squad. By the time it made a line formation here, this platoon, at least these 2 squads, as they made a line formation here and were firing at the personnel that were firing at them from this angle here, from around this elevation. As that was occurring, here we're trying to open fire on the forces on the other side of the gas station as this squad kicked in the door to the inside of the gas station and would fire out the windows at these personnel, using it as a fighting position while the vehicles began to move forward and lay down heavy fire, shredding up many of these trucks to pieces, in addition to these squads of dismounts, including this squad that made a line formation, firing Al-Qatans and HJ-08s at some of the trucks as well as 40mm fire coming from the vehicles moving up. Not to mention the small arms fire at the dismounted personnel as well, coming from the dismounted squads, even vehicle-based fire from the vehicle line. They're still in their 5-vehicle double column formation, firing over at these vehicles at the same time. The fire was coming in at these vehicles from this group of vehicles, this platoon right here, passing by these trailers at the opening of the map, and the forces inside the gas station laying down small arms fire and Al-Qatan fire at the personnel, as well as HJ-08 fire when necessary. As the fighting was over relatively quickly here, at the opening of the map, this large group of militia personnel and their technicals was annihilated by 4,000 pounds being dropped from this Mirage 5 as it had come in and pounded them with these thousands of pounds of munitions. Very similar to this scene right here, as 2 more are on the way to pound this hill in the background, as the mechanized infantry forces in their wheeled Al-Fad armored fighting vehicles and dismounted proceeded to clear the way as they fired all they had at their opposition, including even their W-85 heavy machine guns, which were devastating and were considered an anti-materiel weapon, as also their Mirage 5s fired their Ra'ad cruise missiles at targets off map, which the Ra'ad looks similar to this. They would slam targets in the city, all as this fighting was underway. In the north of the map, while all of this action was going on in the southern portions of this battlefield, with the mortar strikes, the munition strikes that were air-based munitions, even the Shahad 238 strikes, as these were all Shahad 238 victims, as these Shahads right here, these 2, and there's one right here, were coming in to hit these targets that were moving into the area ostensibly to get up with the rest of these forces who just got annihilated, and to attack the Pakistani forces that were down on the road below the steep elevation, and were in turn hit by by 2 of the Shahed 238s, while the third one proceeded onward, and as this vehicle was moving out of the area, hit it and destroyed it. As it had actually left the map, it was intercepted and annihilated, while this one was destroyed at the opening of the map. Some of the shrapnel had engaged the back of the truck, but did nothing to the truck other than put some holes in the tail of it, as these Shahed 238s would also likewise intercept forces fleeing the battlefield. As they were on foot, it took them some time to proceed the roughly over half-mile distance to try to flee the area, and were hit by 3 different loitering munitions, as the rest of these here, one would hit this technical, while the other 3 would go and hit targets off map, all paving the way for the advance of the rest of the battalion. There are 4 mechanized infantry companies, which behind those 4 companies were the entire headquarters company over the entire battalion. Its headquarters and support company, responsible for command and logistics over the whole battalion. along with the rest of the fire support company, also off map, as this was a full company right here of mechanized infantry, and this was a full company of mechanized infantry, as in the north these homes had already been cleared, and this squad was emerging from this house having had cleared it, and their vehicles had moved up as per SOP for clearing buildings. And as they did so, as all this combat was occurring in the south, in the north, these technicals were flying through the desert and down the access road to deploy forces to assist their other forces who were now being engaged by these different dismounted squads of this platoon that were all bounding and covering tactically together, where they would bound ahead, lay down fire, then they would bound ahead, lay down fire, and then they would bound ahead and then lay down fire if they had to. But they were already being engaged at the opening of this map by these forces right here. The mortars had been called in, and one had struck and annihilated this technical as this one was moving in, and then as they dismounted troops, they were being fired at by the forces on the ground and their vehicles sitting back as mobile fire support platforms, which totally annihilated these vehicles, along with strafing attacks coming from this Mirage 5 firing its nose cannon, which devastated these two technicals that were lined up on the side of the road here, which shredded them to pieces, along with these mortar strikes getting this one, and causing some KIAs amongst these personnel here, while they were also being fired at, exchanging small arms fire back and forth with these Pakistani forces. As that was going on, this technical had flown up, as well as this one here, and deployed their men from the back, 5 each, at which point they were engaging these forces that were bounding and covering to close with them. At that point in time, these technicals had been destroyed by HJ-08 fire from the anti-tank missiles themselves, as well as Al-Qatan fire from the disposable anti-tank weapons, as the Al-Qatan could have been considered on the same level as the AT-4, only the thing with the Al-Qatan was that it had a laser range finder and ballistic computer attached to it, which could be detached from the used up tube after the one-shot weapon had been used and attached to another one, which made the Al-Qatan a relatively special weapon in many cases. It was actually a great weapon, as it had a powerful punch to it. As the forces were closing with the Americans, including this squad bounding and covering just off map against these other forces, and there were some just off the map as well, exchanging fire with this squad from this platoon, with their vehicle giving them fire support that they had dismounted from. These vehicles and troops, as they bounded and covered, had closed with and destroyed their enemies, including their technicals, of which only the driver was left within them, firing out of the windows. As this one had flown in at the opening of the map, it had been hit by an Al-Qatan and destroyed, didn't even get to deploy its troops. By a matter of minutes, this battle had concluded over this large area. Again, a 2 mile by 1 mile area north to south, 2 miles east to west, 1 mile north to south. As the mortars, the air power from the Mirage 5s, and the fighter aircraft, the JF-17B, very potent fighter, had provided the air-to-ground support, as in close air support, for their forces on the field. And the Iranians had supplied their Shahed 238s as well, which had assisted in destroying reinforcements, as well as cutting off the retreat of American forces, giving the ability to strike in depth, along with the aircraft, of course, striking deep in depth with their Ra'ad cruise missiles, especially from far away, hitting targets in the city, as well as being able to fly over your enemy and drop munitions on them, and the mortars as well. striking in depth, destroying reinforcements, while also decimating enemy contact. The Americans were shot up by 30mm fire, 12.7mm fire, and small arms fire from the troops on the ground. Everything from their general purpose or light machine guns to their rifles to their heavier weapons like their Al-Qatans, as well as also their HJ-08s, such as this one being fired by a soldier in this wedge formation just off the illustration. Simply decimating their targets with all of these combined forces. Now Qatan being fired here. Winning over control of the entry and exit point to the city of the I-40 corridor. As now the Pakistani forces of this mechanized infantry battalion had thoroughly advanced, as these were 4 companies in a column, now moving to the very end of the battlefield, as these other forces would thoroughly sweep the battlefield by moving up into the areas to do a battle damage assessment, although they moved cautiously as it pertained to the dismounts, as they bounded and covered tactically up this hill, up the steep end, while checking the area for any surviving enemy combatants to either take POW or eliminate. As they cleared the flanks, the main force of 4 companies moved up the access road, while these other forces held their position after clearing the flanks throughout the entire battlefield area. As now, I-40, the entry and exit point to the city, as it gradually became more urbanized the further east that one went in this area, was now under Pakistani control, and now they would use their ISR dominance to monitor the entire area, as all the company level quadcopter assets would basically patrol this whole area to control the entry and exit via I-40 in and out of the city, and therefore would be able to scour the area for enemy combatants of any type, such as armed reactionary civilians, including the militia-type forces they had already encountered, as there would be another similar force that would be encountered in the south later in the battle. They had won this battle as their other forces were clearing flanks elsewhere of armed reactionary civilians as well. In the next battle, in this sub-series, the Albuquerque/Kirtland sub-series, the Pakistani forces of one of 2 armored battalions was making entry into the city to prepare the route to engage American military forces that were downtown, in addition to the Iranian forces and additional Pakistani forces now laying a pontoon bridge and preparing to cross to reinforce their other forces on the east side of the city. As this armored battalion would assist the combat engineers now wrapping up their operations against armed reactionary civilians south of the city, now moving north and into it. They would assist them in blocking off any crossing from the last remaining bridges left in the city, which was the I-40 bridge and adjacent street bridge, while the armored battalion, to get there, would have to fight its way through an outcropping of armed reactionary civilians popping up in the northwest of the city near the Double Eagle Airport, serving 2 purposes of clearing the flanks for their mechanized infantry battalion to capture the airport, as well as closing off entry and exits for American military forces across the only last remaining bridge that was left in the city, as the pontoon bridge would be firmly under control and would be a thoroughly controlled crossing point, as it was laid by the combat engineers and would be guarded by the combat engineers of the Pakistani 18th Infantry Division. as they would seize control of the riverbanks, lay their pontoon bridge, and allow for their other forces to cross at will as needed to reinforce other forces throughout the city. In the next installment of this battle, the Pakistani armored forces would be moving into the northwest of the city, again, to clear the flanks. These Viper IFVs are moving adjacent to and on this road. Mirage 5s hitting targets, as per ISR data, of course, and their Al-Khalid main battle tanks. A well-built main battle tank that was the cream of the crop of the Pakistani armored forces, now moving into the northwest of the city to gain control over that portion of the city and eliminate all enemy combatants present. With their air superiority and their ISR superiority in the form of their quadcopter assets and high-altitude recon drones, such as this quadcopter, and of course the recon drones present in the area, the coalition forces could see everything on the fluid, ever-changing modern battlefield, and the Americans had to rely on runners and word-of-mouth communications, as this previous battle has illustrated. And runners and word-of-mouth communications in the reactionary sense did them no good, as they were in the Stone Age, and the coalition was in the Information Age, as the Americans had lost all ISR assets and capabilities and communications assets and capabilities, and thus were more than easy to defeat as a result, as those who had the ISR capabilities, the artificial intelligence capabilities, and the firepower capabilities all meshed together would be they who would win the day, as the coalition was proving on each and every battlefield throughout this entire invasion.